All right, this is Mr. Soder, joined by Mrs. Trentinelli, and we've got a special guest with us today. It's Tom Anderson, who's recently been named the commander of the American Legion Post. For the past several years, Perry Service Learning students have been assisting the American Legion with their annual placement of flags at the Perry Cemetery. It's a time-honored tradition that we'd like to continue even during this time of pandemic, and we've got a plan to do it safely. But there are a few procedural things that volunteers need to know. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Anderson to kind of walk us through some of the do's and don'ts while you're volunteering at the cemetery this Friday.
Thank you, Mr. Soder. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to those that are going to be assisting, and I certainly appreciate the assistance of the students that are going to come out and help honor and remember our deceased veterans. I'm going to give a little bit of background first while we're on the cover slide here to talk about the American Legion and a little bit about flags. So the American Legion is committed to mentoring youth, advocating patriotism and honor, promoting strong national security, and supporting our fellow service members and veterans, and honoring our deceased veterans. I spent 24 years serving as a submariner in the Navy, and I want to start today by sharing my perspective on the American flags that you'll be placing on the graves of our veterans. As you know, the media has generated a lot of press over the last few years about their perspective on how the American flag and what it stands for should be honored. But to those of us that are veterans, the American flag has flown proudly throughout our history and has served as an unwavering symbol of hope and strength to our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen throughout their military service. Even in death, whether at home or on a distant battlefield, the American flag remains a symbol as it drapes a casket of deceased veterans and accompanies them to their final resting place, where upon burial, it flies peacefully over their graves. On behalf of American Legion Perry Memorial Post 697, I would like to thank you for volunteering to assist us in honoring the veterans buried in our local cemetery. I ask that you give me your undivided attention during the next 10 minutes or so as I provide you information you will need to properly place flags in our cemetery. Next slide, please. So who is a military veteran? It's a person who served in the active duty, military, naval or air service, and who was discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. That would include those that have served in the U.S. Army, the U.S. Marine Corps, the Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. As you go to the cemetery to place flags, you will notice that there are a number of flag holders throughout the cemetery. Again, our mission as the American Legion, and those of you that are helping me, is to put flags on the graves of military veterans. Not to say that you'll run into other markers that you'll ask, why aren't we honoring these folks? Well, they have their own organizations such as the police, fire, and there's other organizations out there that have served the country in their own way, in their own special way. Again, we are out there just to honor the military veterans. Next slide, please. Just by way of a little bit of background as to how many veterans we have buried in the cemetery, we are at about 1,000 veterans, believe it or not, in Perry right now. And we have veteran markers that date back to the Revolutionary War, and we have over 100 Civil War veterans buried in our cemeteries, over 350 World War II, over 100 Korean, and you can see the list here. So we have a lot of veterans buried out in the cemetery. So we have a lot of flags to place, but I think broken up in the 6 areas that we have, you should be able to get through your area in about an hour to an hour and a half, and I'll talk a little bit more about those areas on a later slide. Next slide, please. So how do you know that you're at the appropriate grave marker to place a flag? Well, there's actually 3 different types of grave markers in the cemetery. This slide here shows you wars. So you see the Revolutionary War, the Korean War, World War II, etc. So if you see the word war on a flag holder, then that is a military veteran that is buried there. Next slide, please. One of the problems that we run into, though, is that some of the flag holders are not totally clear. Civil War veterans will have this star or the circular flag holder at their graves, and it says GAR. The GAR stands for the Grand Army of the Republic, and these are Union Army veterans that are buried in the cemetery. So just be aware that it's not always going to be 100% obvious as to whether you're looking at a veteran's grave or maybe something else. If you're in doubt, put a flag there. But again, as I showed in the previous slide, many of them will indicate wars, the theater, be it Vietnam or whatever, World War II, and it'll have the word war. The Civil War is really kind of the most difficult one to understand, that this was a Civil War veteran, and you've now seen this particular slide with how those are marked. So the next category of veterans that are going to be marked at the cemetery are those who did not serve during a wartime or conflict. And those you'll normally see by service. So as you see in the upper left-hand corner here, if they served in the Army, or if they're just a veteran period, it'll say U.S. veteran, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Coast Guard. So that's the second class of U.S. military veteran grave markers that you will place a flag in. Next slide, please. It's the flag holders for the veteran organizations that they were part of. The American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, often called the VFW, and the AMVETS, and there is an AMVETS post in Perry also. And those graves may be marked by, those particular markers. Again, those are veterans, and you do place a flag in there. You'll also notice in the lower right-hand corner, there's a submarine plaque, U.S. submarine veteran from World War II. So sometimes there are, modifications to what you might think are standard plaques out there. But again, obviously a U.S. submarine veteran would receive a flag too. Next slide, please.
Question.
So I talked about the three, yes.
Will we see multiple markers on a single grave, or will it be just one marker?
You may see multiple markers. Well, there is one grave that's kind of a American Legion grave, and I think there's maybe 8 or so markers there. But if there is a marker there, go ahead and put a flag on it, even if it is multiple markers for the same grave. And in some cases, if it's a husband and wife and they both served in the military, then they might each have their own marker. So just be aware of that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and then, so again, there's really those three classes. Those that served in war, those that have service markers or just say U.S. veteran, and those that are, have the markers for the veterans organizations that they belong to. The other thing you're going to see out there are these veteran grave plaques. And I just want to make you aware of this because I've seen in the past where students have put flags in the ground, like next to that upper left one there where it says, Joe Bailey, his Purple Heart and all of that. Generally, we don't do that, although if you do see one that doesn't have a flag holder, then you can go ahead and do that. But the important thing to know here is that many of these markers are foot markers for the grave. So you'd see that brass plaque mounted at the foot of Joe Bailey's grave. And if you go to his headstone, that's where you should see the flag holder. So you would just put the flag in that holder. Having said that, though, I think there are still a couple of graves out in the cemetery that don't have grave markers. And if it was in some cases, they don't have headstones either. So in that case, I would, you can go ahead and put a marker by the foot marker if that's all that they have. And I'll try to get a flag holder out there at some point to mark that. You should see very, very few, maybe onesie twosie in the whole cemetery that don't have the grave markers, but or the grave flag holders. But I just wanted to make you aware of this, because a lot of folks will see that foot stone and think that, geez, this is where this person's buried. He or she is buried there, but if you go to their headstone, you'll have more information on them. Okay, so kind of to pull a lot of this together right now, again, there's about 1,000 veterans that are buried in the Perry Cemetery. And just be aware that, the family and friends of those buried there do come and visit these graves. And what you're doing is very important to the family. If a family finds that there is not a flag there, they generally go to the township office, and, they're sometimes they're upset about it. So we want to make sure that we get the flags on those that have sacrificed for the country. So the other piece of this is that the flags will be out in boxes, and I'll show you that in a later slide here as to where you'll be able to pick up flags. But we reuse flags 2 or 3 years depending on how tattered they get and all of that. And I've gone through all of those flags to try to make sure that I threw away the ones that were discolored or torn, have real heavy stains on them, or the flag didn't have all its staples, so it wasn't hanging properly, or somebody decided to put their name on it, or it had a really bent pole. So don't use those flags. Just return them to the box, and I'll take care of them later, because I had to go through about 1,000 flags, and that's a lot of flags to go through. And I certainly would expect that I missed a few flags that don't deserve to go on graves, because again, we need to honor these folks, and we need to do it in a very dignified manner. So we want to make sure that we have good flags that we on the graves. Next slide, please. So as I said before, we are military veteran graves. You will find markers for the fire department, for police. We have nothing against them. It's just they don't get flags to put on their graves. So those organizations would hopefully put flags on those that have served our country in that manner. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are a number of these fraternities. You have the Masons and this Independent Order of Odd Fellows, which is a really odd name, I guess you would say. But they have served, the country in their own special way, a lot of charity and things of that nature. Although they've done good for the country, and they should be proud of that and be, have a marker, a flag holder for that. We, again, do not put flags in these holders. So again, our mission is to go out and place flags on the graves of military veterans. Next slide, please. So we've divided up the cemetery into 6 areas, and we should be able to socially distance here. And if you make a copy of any slides, I'm assuming that you guys can copy of the slide, or I can take some of these out of here. I'll have to ask what's the best way. But I'm going to have flags pre-staged in boxes. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, they're in cardboard boxes. Please be careful with the boxes, because we will use those when we collect up the flags at the end of the summer. But I'll have flag boxes placed in 3 areas here where you can go pick up flags. There's generally a dozen or so flags in each bundle. So you can grab, 3 or 4 bundles depending on how many you feel comfortable carrying. We don't want to lay them on the ground. We want to make sure that you keep them, that you hold on to them while you're placing them. So you will find pickup areas in the 3 areas there. If you have any questions, I'll be out there. I assume that Mr. Soder will be out in the cemetery. I'm not sure about Mr. Trettinelli at this point, but anyhow, you can ask questions. So I would prefer that you guys, do things to really socially distance, like maybe start areas 1 and 3 from the road and work back into the cemetery, and area 2 start at the back of the cemetery and work forward. And area 4, probably the best thing for you to do is to work back in your area. And 5 and 6, you guys can figure out the best way. Even though 5 and 6 are larger areas, there are not a lot of graves on the south end of those areas there. So next slide, please. So I can't overemphasize that safety is a top priority out there. And I would certainly open it to Mr. Soder and Mr. Trettinelli to talk, to share any of their thoughts on this, but please practice social distancing. Take your time. Don't touch your eyes, nose, or mouth. The flags have been sitting for at least a couple of weeks, so there should be no contamination on the flags whatsoever. But the flags are dirty too, though, so just be aware that they've been out there before. You'll notice that some of them are dirty. So yeah, it's another good reason not to, touch your eyes, nose, or mouth while you're out there. And then make sure you wash your hands as soon as you possibly can. And don't be afraid to ask questions during this, because we want to make sure it's done right, because there are people that come out and honor those graves. And this is very, very important to the families of deceased veterans. So again, I'd like to thank you for supporting this effort. It is a very worthy effort, and I look forward to seeing you guys out there.
Thanks so much, Tom. I think I'll just add to your safety list there and encourage students, if they have masks, to consider wearing them for this event. And then the one question I wanted to ask you, Tom, just based on previous experience, I know sometimes because of lawn mowing and things that take place at the cemetery, just general maintenance, sometimes those military markers get damaged. Sometimes they're bent. Sometimes they're really loose in the ground and almost, in there vertically rather than, or really in at a diagonal rather than vertical. So any tips or tricks for, repairing a damaged military marker?
Well, I would say that you try to get it as upright as you possibly can. And if you could just let me know where it is so that I can take a look at it, because we do have some grave markers back at the office that we can replace. And if we don't, we can order some new ones to replace them. So if you can just let me know, because I'll be around the cemetery walking around, I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to seeing all the students on Friday at 1 o'clock at the Perry Cemetery. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. You guys have a good day.